Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Brinsley. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Really looking forward to it. It's not every day you get to interview your boss for a YouTube channel. So anyone listening, that's in the space right now.
That's in
I'm
the
interviewing
space
my
here.
boss, and we're going to look at, I guess, your personal journey to building a coaching business rather than a coaching practice. Although I know you do coach as well, but you're obviously the owner of Animas. And we're going to look at your journey to building your business. But I'm also really interested in a couple of other things today. You know, who you are as a human being and who you are as a coach, and how those three, I guess, things intertwine whilst you've been on this kind of journey. Does
Yeah,
that sound like a nice exploration for you?
sounds good.
Good. So first things first, who are you as a coach, and who are you as a business owner? What's the makeup of your business as well? Like, what's the commercial elements?
All right. So who am I as a coach? Who am I as a business owner and the commercial element? I thought you were going to say who am I as a person too, which might be worth kind of wrapping into that as well, like folding in like a kind of an existential omelette.
Mhm.
Um, and wow, where do I start? I don't think of myself too much as a coach. I've coached for a long, long time, since the early 2000s, but I don't coach a lot anymore. I coach occasionally, very occasionally. Um, when I do coach, I would say that I am a bit of an amalgam of coaching and sometimes a bit of mentoring, and sort of I mix things in. I don't consider myself particularly boundaried as a coach in the sense of like the discipline of coaching, which is partly why I don't coach much anymore, because it's like I use more of my full self rather than just the thing called coaching. When I was coaching in a very existential way. So a lot of my fascination was, and which also relates to who I am as a person, is I'm fascinated by who you are in the world and what that creates for you as a result. And I think that struck me over my lifetime, and I can explain why actually to some degree, why this came to me, but was this realization that people get stuck with the same problem for way, 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 way too long. Like, it amazes me how long people get stuck with the same issue in their life, like sometimes years and years and years, and you just go like, why would you allow that, and that's kind of driven me as a coach, as a business owner. I very rarely get stuck with a problem in my life that causes me discomfort, because it's like, there's no need for that, unless of course it's something that's irresolvable, something to do with health, which I've been super fortunate not to have a problem with. But anything else that tends to be more situational, it's like, just get it resolved. And that's really kind of driven my whole approach to coaching, to my business, and to my life as a whole. And I think that's because, without wishing to go off on too much of a tangent straight away, I think it's because I got married very early, and it was an unsuccessful marriage. But it was quite a long one. So we met at the age of 15, we got married at 21, and I divorced her at 28. And so that was 13 years of my early life. It was a lot. I mean, nearly, essentially half of my first 30 years nearly. And I look back at that and I thought, wow, why did I allow that to last so long? Like, I knew probably 10 years earlier that I shouldn't be in this marriage, but I just kept going, kept going, kept going. Genuinely thought I had no agency. Genuinely. Like, I can remember the feelings I had at the time, where somehow hoping that something would happen that would resolve it for me, and that somehow this solution would come along, and it was a horrible phase of my life when I look back. But at the same time, it was what I thought was living, and I was building this horrible level of debt as well. Like, I was living beyond our means. I was supporting her. We both had jobs, but I was supporting her, and so I was building this huge amount of debt. But I wasn't telling her about it. I had zero courage back in those days. I couldn't have a conversation with somebody about something that was difficult. So I was building up this debt, and she had no idea. And then one day I just had enough. I broke. At the age of 28, I just snapped, and I just decided, I've got to get out of here. And I left a piece of, it was shocking looking back. I was such a weakling, but I left this piece of paper on the mirror. I mean, she kind of knew to some degree, but I left this piece of paper saying, I'm leaving, and one day you'll be glad that this happened. Completely not facing the fact that I had to, this wasn't just going to disappear overnight. So, like, I still had to go through the process of managing it. And so then I had to face the reality, and I had to tell her about the debt and everything. So I left, and I gave her everything. I gave her the house, gave her the car, gave her everything. And I left with all the debt. And I moved into this, I think you know the story, I moved into this bedsit where every time the guy above had a shower, his dirty water would drip through my ceiling into a bucket, and I'd have to empty it into the bath. But it was the most liberating experience, like this sense of being, wow, I've lived 28 years under the yoke of somebody else, first my dad and then my wife. And now it's like, okay, this is where my life starts. And I still, to this day, divide my life into three parts. The first part is being a kid. The second part is being married engaged in marriage for 13 years. And then the third part is everything else. And I think that's utterly guided me as a coach, as a business owner, and as a human being ever since. It really has, because I refuse to compromise on what my life and my business and, you know, anything. I refuse to compromise if I don't have to, really. That's kind of like, that's what drives me under all of this stuff.
Thanks for getting straight into it there, and I appreciate you answering that question, who you are as a human being. And I'm glad you did. Or part of who you are as a human being anyway. And when I heard you say that, I guess it kind of makes sense when you're looking at, well, why do people let these issues last for them? And I guess that experience you've had plays a part in that view that you now have on not letting things build for, like you say, for a year or two. Is that
and I think the heart of it all is facing the reality. I mean, you know what Animas stands for. Of course you do, Brinsley, but a lot of people don't. But it came from the idea of anima being life, but animas being courage. But for me, the courage part is not how you live life, although that's part of it. It's the courage to face your life. What is my reality right now? Looked at without sugarcoating it. What's the truth of my life? And if you don't take the time to really look at your life or your relationship or your job or whatever it is that's bothering you, your health, if you don't look at it, you're not going to deal with it. And so the whole point of Animas was the courage to face the truth. Because what I noticed over the years of coaching was that we would come at it from a point of view as a coach of like, what's your goal? And often people would either have a goal which wasn't deep down the real goal, or they wouldn't have a goal because they'd be in a state of ambiguity and ambivalence and confusion and so on. And this idea that coaching was about goal setting quickly showed itself to me to be a bit of a fallacy on the whole. And most people don't come with this super clear, clean goal they want to move towards. They come with a state of real like unknowing. But so the first step is really like, look at stuff, look at it square in the eye and figure out whether you're happy with your life. And I remember coaching somebody some years ago who, I won't go into the detail, but by the third session, I said, how are you arriving here today? And she said, really sad. And I said, what's that sadness about? And she said, I realized I'm not happy with my life. And I said, well, that's a good starting point, because that to me is where we need to start from. You know, we don't start with essentially she was trying to build a business, but the business was really papering over the cracks of her life massively. And the business, if I'd coached her on growing that business, I would have been ignoring the reality of what that business was trying to solve, which wasn't getting to the root of the issue. So, you know, to keep coming back to your question, who am I as a coach? I really care about helping people face the truth and then figure out, what am I going to do with that? Because funny enough, let me go back one more step, which is when I was in debt and I had loads of credit cards. It was awful. And every month I'd get these credit card bills through and I wouldn't look at them. And I'd put them in I used to jokingly call in my head the briefcase of doom. I was a bank manager and I had one of those, like a proper old fashioned briefcase. You remember the ones with like little padlock thing?
I remember. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I put these letters in the briefcase, but I knew my wife would never look in there. It was my briefcase, and they would just pile up, like properly pile up. And then every 3 or 4 months, I go, all right, it's time to face the music. And I'd open my briefcase. My wife had gone to work. I'd open my briefcase, get all this pile of letters out, and I'd open them up one by one, and then I'd sort them into, okay, here's all the credit card bills of this one, and here's all, and okay, what's that? And I'd count it up, and in my mind, I'd be like, right, it's going to be like 20,000 and 30,000. How did that happen? It was horrendous. But what I noticed every single time was the minute I knew, this sense of calm would descend on me. I'd be like, okay, now I know. Even though it was more than I thought, at least I knew the truth. And that moment of coming face to face with the truth was this amazingly peaceful moment, because then you say, okay, what am I going to do? And almost everything I did back then to solve the truth didn't work. And the same thing would replicate. And it was only until I finally broke through my patterns of don't just face the truth, really do something about it. But at least I took from that whole journey, I took this thing that the truth matters. It was unbelievably profound for me that recognizing the truth matters was, you know, at the heart of everything.
Thank you for sharing that. And as you were speaking, I'm thinking about, you know, the truth and the subjective truth, and how do you even know sometimes what the truth is? Because I get that you've got this existential lens that you have as a coach. You would call yourself an existential coach, right?
Yeah, broadly.
But in that philosophy, also, there is almost a part of a question around truth. What is even truth?
Yeah.
Did it ever kind of go round in your head trying to figure out what is the truth? Or did you always know that you were unhappy in this phase of your life and you needed to change it?
So back then, I was a different character. I was very weak when I look back, very unable to have courageous conversations. Now I'll have any conversation, any conversation I'll have every single time. But back then it was so hard for me to go like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. My truth was a feeling. The reality was the context in which that feeling sat, which was that my wife might have had a completely different experience from me about what was going on between us. So she would have said, well, that's my truth. And then the truth, the actual truth is what sort of all of that works within. And I was thinking about this the other day because I was kind of talking, I was thinking to myself, I often do like thinking about coaching and the philosophy of coaching. And I was thinking about the idea of truths and that there are things which are true and there are things that are your truth and they're different. And in a sense, you could say that your truth is the feeling you have about something. That's your truth. Also, the perspective you have on something is your truth, but they're not truth as such. Like the credit card bill was the truth. That was, I couldn't just go like, you know what, that's not true. I owe half of that. No, that's what I owe. My response to that was my truth. And that bit's real. Nobody can deny that. Nobody can say, no, Nick, you feel fine about it. It's like, I definitely don't. That's my truth. Now, the question is, what do I do with that? Do I change the truth or do I change how I respond to the actual truth? Do I change my response or do I change the reality by doing something? And so, I think there's different kinds of truths, but in a way, the ultimate truth is the one that's real that we have to contend with. And some of those are existential. We're all going to die. We all have to make choices. We all have to relate to people. None of us can control the future. Those are actual truths. And then there's our interpretation and our response to that, which becomes our truth.
Thank you. I'd love to go down some of these strands with you, but while we're here looking at who you are as a human being, who you are as a coach, and I find it really interesting that you spoke about that kind of potted history when you look at yourself as a human being. Let's look at you as a business owner quickly before we kind of go back there. What is the makeup of your business? Because you've built a coaching business rather than a practice, but coaching is a component of that, right?
Yeah.
Just give us a little bit of a flavor of your coaching business.
When you say my coaching business, you mean Animas?
Yeah, but also you've got the ICCS, right? So
right. So Animas is my main coaching business, which is a coaching school, as you know. And then we have ICCS, which is the International Centre for Coaching Supervision, which is a spin-off, let's say, or sister company of Animas, which takes highly experienced coaches, often MCC level, and trains them in supervision skills, which is a somewhat different set of skills. But fundamentally, we're a training company. That's it. In a nutshell, we're a training company. We happen to train people who want to become coaches or people who want to become supervisors. So it's really not that complicated. I think in many ways, it's not complicated. Where I get more excited, though, is less about the nuts and bolts of the commercial side of training, because it is a commercial side. But I get fascinated by how does Animas have an impact to the profession as a whole? I mean, that's where I get a lot of my juice from nowadays. I'm really interested in, here we are, an emergent profession, 30 years old, let's say, give or take. And we're still finding our sense of self vis-a-vis other professions like psychotherapy or counseling or anything else, leadership training and all sorts of other stuff. And I feel like part of our role as a coaching school is to help the profession as a whole navigate that kind of those tricky waters of what's our identity as a profession and not fall into the traps of just repeating what's gone before, but equally don't fail to learn from what's gone before. So in a way, I'm sort of not really answering your question, because the answer to your question is we're a training company, and my aim is to be, a really beautiful training company that focuses on super high quality input to our learners and a support system for them afterwards. That's really that part. But my own kind of sense of self from a business perspective is, how does my business feed into that wider profession?
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's chronologically track this, and we're going to get to the business soon and the impact that you'd like it to make on the profession. A brief potted history. What I heard about your first quarter of your life. Why? I'm interested in how you arrived at setting up a training provider. What happened before and why did you do it?
Yeah. Do you know the story at all?
I think I know some of it.
Some of it, yeah, okay. I mean, I know this isn't just for you, and it's for people watching this video, but I was kind of curious whether you did know. So basically, I after my first divorce, I've been divorced twice, and which is all kind of part of it as well, because it's been an amazing journey of growth, going through divorces and starting businesses, and it really is, you learn an awful lot through that process. And so after my first divorce, I initially thought, that's it. Like, I've had my ambitious phase of life. I was a bank manager. I'm just going to chill now for the rest of my life. And that lasted about a year. And then I went to work for this guy who ran a conference company doing conferences on social issues. And I went to work for him doing invoicing and so on. But very quickly, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So I started to do my own private research on conferences. And I took my first one. I said, hey, we could do a conference on young people who sexually abuse other children, because it was quite a big thing at the time in terms of like a big social policy issue that was coming up. So I did some research and I said, let me put this conference together, which I did. We did really, really well. As a conference, it succeeded. And so I moved into doing a lot more conference building. And then after about 2 years, about a year and a half, maybe, I was like, I could do this myself. And it sounds very disloyal when I look back, but in a way, I just kind of think, well, you carve your own path in life. And I decided I'd much rather own my own business and just keep working for somebody. So I set up a conference company, and I started doing conferences on domestic violence and homelessness and gypsy and traveler education, and you name it. I was doing stuff on any issue that I felt had some component of intractable social issues that aren't just about like planning policy. It was to do with like human issues. I didn't know that at the time, but looking back, I could say, oh, Steve Jobs talks about the looking at your breadcrumbs, and I can look back and go, oh wow, it's interesting. Every conference I ever did was something to do with humans facing the challenge of being alive and their interaction with the governmental system that either supported them or hindered them in some way. I didn't know that, but that was what was going on. And so I did all these conferences, but what I recognized very quickly was that conferences are really great. I love conferences. They're really great at disseminating information, but they're not very good at evoking change, because people don't get to look inwardly at their own stuff, as in, okay, well, that's interesting, but what do I need to do? So I started to run these little groups I didn't know it was called coaching back then, to be honest. I didn't even know it was called facilitation as such, but I ran these groups where I'd get together police officers or social workers or housing officers from different authorities and different police forces around a particular theme that I wasn't an expert in, but that I could facilitate a conversation around. So it'd be like, okay, well, we're going to talk about domestic violence, but I don't have any answers. You do. Somehow we've got 8 police forces here who are dealing with domestic violence. Where are your successes? Where are you struggling? Who's not struggling with that? How do we learn from each other? And that was really interesting. And I started to learn about how you break down barriers between individuals to learn between themselves, which is why I've always been a group coach. I absolutely love group coaching compared to anything else. But through that process, I started to then coach individuals. You'd get to know them and you say, well, I didn't know, I still didn't know it was called coaching, but I quickly learned it was called coaching. So I then eventually took a coaching qualification in about 2006. So this was 2002 initially. Then 2006, I trained as a coach, and I started to do much more one-to-one coaching. And I learned the GROW model and all the classic stuff. But then very quickly, you learn that when you're doing one-to-one coaching, it isn't about goal setting. It's about the muddy waters of life. And very, very few people come to coaching. I don't know if you feel the same, Brinsley, but very few people come to coaching saying, here's my clear goal. I just need to kind of figure out the plan. It's like, typically, if somebody can do that, they don't need a coach. What they really come with is all this kind of melange of confusion and stuff. And so I started to coach individuals. And then I thought, well, I could start a coaching school. And that's kind of where I got to my first coaching school. It's a little bit more complicated than that. If I can just add a bit of pepper to the recipe, because what also happened at the time was I got married again, I got divorced again, I gave my wife everything again, which is one of my great habits, and I ended up buying a £25,000 30-year-old canal boat to live on, which was in 2007. And so I decided to cruise around the UK on this old canal boat running my business. But I got so entranced by kind of cruising around the UK, I started to forget to run my business, and I ended up on the verge of bankruptcy. And I can remember to this day being in Little Venice in Paddington on the back of my boat, and I literally had the bankruptcy papers to sign. And then I realized, hold on a sec, because I thought I'd keep my boat. I thought, if I don't know why, but I thought I can go bankrupt and keep my boat because it was my home. And they said, no, you will lose your boat too. And I was like, well, that's a bit pointless then, isn't it? I might as well just kind of give it one more shot. And so what happened was I sold my boat for 20,000 quid. I'd been living on it for about 18 months. I sold it for 15,000 quid, sorry, 15,000 quid cash. And I had that cash in a brown envelope, moved into my best mate's ex-wife's bedroom with her on 2 single beds. And I had my brown envelope of cash under the bed. And from that, I started what became Animas.
Wow. If there's any budding filmmakers watching that, or writers, that is a movie, if I've ever heard one.
It was interesting. You know, I often think to myself that both times I've started a business was so risk-free for me. The first time I was living in that bedsit with water coming through the ceiling, no risk in losing that lifestyle. And then the second time I was living, you know, I was living on a boat, but then moved into my best mate's ex-wife's bedroom. No risk there either. So it didn't take a lot of courage, but what it did take was the willingness to kind of go, well, all the way. That 15,000 quid I could have protected, but instead I went, right, 15,000 quid, how do I grow a business with this? And I started buying what back in those days was the main source of marketing for me, which was expos. I would buy a stand at the One Life show, the Mind, Body, Spirit show, the yoga show, the business expo, all these shows at Earl's Court and Olympia, and I've forgotten where else. Oh my goodness, I did not like them at all. They're horrendous for me. As an introverted sort of person, to stand at a table for 3 days solid, going, hello, would you like to talk about coaching all day long? It was absolutely horrendous, but it's what I had to do. That's how I grew my coaching school.
That's so interesting to hear how introverted you were, because most people know you as a really powerful public speaker. I mean, I certainly do. And I've seen some of the talks you give where it looks like you're really in flow in that moment. So that's something that's developed over time.
No, I don't think so. I was always a good speaker in some ways. I don't think I'm by any means like like the best speaker, but I think I've always been a decent speaker. And I don't see that contradicts introversion in some ways. Like I think small talk I find extremely difficult. And so being at a stand all day long where you have to engage people in small talk in order to get them into what you really want to talk to them about, I find it extremely hard. But being in front of a camera or being in front of a room with 200 people and just talking about what I'm passionate about, I'm good with that all day long.
That's an interesting distinction. I never thought of it like that. I guess the small talk is some of the things that people don't want to engage in, like you say. Okay, so there's so much in there. I'm just kind of thinking about that now as I replay that back. And it's interesting to hear that you were doing invoices for the person that was running those conferences, because I was trying to figure out, because I know some of your story, how did you get from banking, because you were in banking, weren't you, before, right?
So what happened, Brisley, I was a banker. That sounds very grandiose. I was a branch manager for a really dodgy bank called HFC, which is now defunct. I think it got bought by HSBC, but it was a proper dodgy American bank that did lots of interest-free loans through the furniture companies, and then they tried to sell high-interest loans later. Horrible company. But anyway, I was a bank manager there. From doing my degree in philosophy, I got snapped up by Abbey National. Snapped up. It was the only place that gave me a job. So I went to Abbey National to become a trainee bank manager. Then I left Abbey National, went to HFC Bank. And then from there, I left to become self-employed as a financial advisor with Allied Dunbar, another defunct organization. And I was selling endowment policies and pensions and all sorts of stuff. And one of my clients was this chap called Lewis, and he ran this conference company. And at some point he said, Nick, come and work for me, and you can build a financial arm of my company. Well, the financial arm was doing invoices. I didn't know that at the time, but I was desperate because I was divorced. I was living in that bedsit with water, and I was on interest only. On commission only with Allied Dunbar. That was tough, and so he kind of lured me in with a salary, £16,000 salary, and I can remember like just feeling, well, at least it's secure, 16,000 quid, you know. So that's how I ended up going to work for him, and then from there, I did my conference company, and I went from earning 16,000 one year to 105,000 profit in the very first year of business. And I was like, whoa, wow. That blew my mind that you can change your life that quickly, you know?
That is a big step up.
It was huge. It was life-changing. I made a complete mess of it because I forgot about corporation tax. Like, there was so much education to be had in this world, Brins, before you finally figure it all out. And so I earned this 105,000 quid, but I didn't pay corporation tax. Well, I did. but I forgot about it. So then I had to pay it over 7 months, £3,000 a month. But I was buying my girlfriend a car, and I was like, I'm the king of the castle, I'll buy you a car. Ridiculous. But you learn these lessons and you finally figure it all out when you're about 50.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you figured it out. So I just want to go back a few steps actually before we get to what happens after the stalls that you set up, marketing face to face, because I'm curious. I think there's a lot in our childhood and our formative years that create internal drivers, perhaps around why we do the things we do and why we're successful. If I put that to you and you think about that, your childhood, perhaps your parenting, so the way you were parented, your experiences, does that filter into why you do the things you do today and the fact that you are an entrepreneur?
I mean, in a way, inevitably, yes, but it's hard to say that in a sort of a causal way, because I've got a brother and a sister and they've turned out very differently from me. So there obviously is a cause and effect, but it's not a clean cut cause and effect. It's not like, well, if you're brought up by my mum and dad, you would have been like this kind of person, because it's like, my brother's the polar opposite of me. Absolutely. All about keeping his life very safe and sound and nothing, whereas I'm, very expansive with my life. So yes, categorically, I can see how, we grew up in a very, I wouldn't say very poor family by any means, but my dad was a scaffolder. My mum was a housewife. He had an industrial accident and he lost an eye. And he was paid out some money, which meant we could move from Plymouth to Tor Point, which was in Cornwall. And it was a nicer life for us. But it's really hard to kind of look at all that and go, that was the cause. Like very early in my life, I was different from my friends. My friends used to call me Victor Mature, because I was, I just seemed very different from them. I was like very Socratic. I remember a friend of mine said he saw a UFO, and instead of kind of like arguing against him, I asked him all these questions until he said, "Oh, I hate you, Bolton. All you do is ask me questions until I have to say, I don't know." Isn't that weird, Brent, that you think I ended up being a coach? And that was like 14 years old. And I can promise you that was a true story. I can remember his name, Simon Edgar. And he's like, "I hate you, Bolton. All you do is ask me questions." So like, I don't know where that came from. There's another possibility. I don't believe this per se. I don't really have much metaphysical beliefs. But there is, another way of looking at the world, which is that you inherit a previous life of some kind. You almost bring some previous wisdom with you. I don't know if that's true or not, but sometimes I feel like it could be true, and as I head towards the twilight of my years, I've got another 50 left, but let's say as I head towards the twilight of my years, I kind of think, I hope I do live again. Because otherwise it's a bit of a waste that you've kind of gone through this whole journey of learning and then you just get born and that's it, it's wasted. I'd love to feel like I'm going to get born again with some degree of even more wisdom than I had. Do you know what I mean? That would be nice, I think.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? Where do we get the traits that we do have? Is it learned? Is it from our parents? Are we like inheriting something?
Who knows, eh?
Yeah, and there's people that in Eastern astrology or people that do Jungian typology or Enneagram that we're born a certain way, perhaps.
So this is interesting because I think before the interview started, you're asking me about certain labels and so on, and this is why I kind of avoid all that structure of thinking around labeling and having a theory of origin. I just don't have a theory. They're all possible. But it almost doesn't matter. What matters to me is how am I experiencing my life, my way, and how am I going to respond to that? Whether it came from my parents, whether it came from Enneagram, whether it came from a previous life, almost doesn't matter because I won't know the truth of that. And the risk is that if I do think that's the truth, that starts to configure my response rather than what I choose to do with it. And so I'm much more interested in what am I feeling? What am I experiencing? What do I want? And how do I make that happen rather than what do I think this causal thing makes me behave like.
And would it be fair to say that is very much an existential lens, what you've got on the view there of that approach?
It is really, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. So you were this Socratic teenager, Victor Mature or whatever they called you, asking questions constantly to your peers and to the world, perhaps. And you've had these experiences in your early years, and then you find yourself building this this coaching business off the back of a very successful policy business. Did you? So you? Oh yeah, of course you are on the verge of bankruptcy again. So you nearly went bankrupt with the
again only once. Only once. I know this is oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I was never on the verge of bankruptcy before. I had a lot of debt, but I didn't feel like I was going to go bankrupt. But yeah, the business thing, yes, it was on the verge of bankruptcy in 2008, and that was really purely the result of taking my eye off the ball. You know, just living on the boat and just chilling and so on, and then just forgetting I had a life to look after.
So then building Animas from this face-to-face marketing, doing all the exposés. I kind of want to get into that journey, but I just want to make sure we've got everything covered that I wanted to around you and kind of, I guess, the human being. Something that I'm interested in about business owners. You know, I ran a business for 10 years, and there's some parallels when I hear you talk about how we can take our eye off the ball of the meaning and the purpose of our business, and how we can just have one vision on perhaps finance, you know, the bottom line, and almost when art becomes monetized, because in a way business is a bit artistic, coaching's artistic, right? But then it's monetized. What I'm interested in is the journey that our ego goes on when we're building a business, because at the start, I guess the ego is quite small. We don't know what we know, and we're not successful. But then at a point, you become really successful, Nick, and that's gone on and gone on. What's it like to work with your ego on that journey?
That's an intriguing question. Wow. That's kind of stumped me. I think the reason it stumped me is because I don't think of the world through that lens. I can see it's an interesting lens, but I'm kind of thinking about working with the ego. It's like when people say I self-sabotage, and I'm saying, well, who's the self that's sabotaging what other self? Like I kind of don't bifurcate my personality into ego and non-ego, or ego and superego, or, you know, any of that. So that's why I'm kind of like, let me see if I can answer this question in an interesting way, or not an interesting way, but like, I think there's no question that as you begin to succeed, you get bigger than your boots, and you don't even realize you're getting bigger than your boots. I can look back at certain, I remember going to this conference, and a friend of mine now who I've known for years, and we went to Everest Base Camp together since, he said the first time he met me, he didn't like me. And I was like, wow, why was that? He said, well, you came into this conference and you looked like you thought you were the bee's knees and you knew everything, and you had this posse of students with you from your coaching school who just followed you around like you were like God. I was like, that's not how I experienced it. So I didn't feel that way, but clearly I exuded that in some way, or at least that was maybe his shadow. I don't know. Maybe that was his shadow being projected on me. Who knows? But at some level, perhaps I can see that that could happen, that you start to think you're the bee's knees, even if deep down inside you still, you know, you're not. So I don't like, it's hard for me to resonate with that question in some ways, because I've never felt very egotistical about my business. What I have, like, I've always felt like I'm a pretty average entrepreneur. I'm a decent entrepreneur compared to a lot of people, but I'm also pretty average compared to a lot of people. And so I've never really had a big ego around myself as an entrepreneur. But where I do think I got captured was more in the mechanics of growth, not about personality, not about selfhood, but about the sheer mechanics of a business. And what happens when a business starts to grow and it almost becomes a snowball that's rolling downhill, because the more it grows, the more it takes on staff. The more it takes on staff, the more you need to get business to support that growing overheads. And the more it does that, etc. And it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of growth. And only if you're really prepared to take the decision to say enough's enough, will that stop? Because otherwise it just keeps on doing that. And as you know, when I came back to the business after, we haven't got to me retiring yet, but anyway, I came back to the business in 2021 and I said, enough's enough. We don't need to keep growing. But that's kind of like the end of this journey so far, I guess. But yeah, I don't feel like my ego's ever been too trapped in this, if I'm honest, Brinsley. I might be wrong. I might utterly be wrong, but I don't feel it.
Yeah, maybe I'm projecting my story onto you, because I certainly noticed my ego took on, you know, a life of its own when I built my business, and it kind of made some errors along the way based on that. Okay, so if we're going to look at it, and a really interesting answer to hear about that. If we're going to look at it from a different perspective, internal drivers, you know, what are your internal drivers to doing what you do and doing it so successfully? Because I'll just share with you a couple of things I've noticed about you. I know that you work a lot, and you really like the work that you do. I think that anyway. I also see your diary because, you know, I have access to your diary, Ruth's diary, Ailey's diary. So I like to look at the diaries and be like, oh, what's Nick up to? What's Ruth up to? It kind of makes me feel like, you know, we're in the office together, even though we're not. But something I noticed about your diary is you're always learning. You're always doing this little training or that little training or going to this little meeting. And it always interests me about that drive to keep learning, keep developing what you're doing. And I wonder where that drive comes from.
I think it's a hard one to answer in some ways, but I think my biggest drive is, well, number one, the drive feels incredibly authentic. So what I do on a day-to-day basis is not driven by the thing that's driving me, which sounds a bit weird. So let's say what's driving me is I want to be rich. Then the things you do on a day-to-day basis are being driven by the actual drive, which is being rich. That doesn't feel like it to me. It almost feels like the things I do on a day-to-day basis are the intrinsic driver. They have the quality of experience I want to have in my life that are why I do them. I'm not doing them to get somewhere. I'm doing them because they themselves provide me with the meaning and the happiness I want in my life. And they are learning, growing. I'm a massive, I just love growing. I don't even sort of think of it in personal development terms. Like, it's not like I learned that growth is a good thing. It's like, it's just naturally in me. I love learning anything. I love, whether it's marketing, whether it's coaching, whether it's philosophy, whether it's supervision, whether it's psychology. It almost doesn't matter. I love this feeling of my brain expanding and my skills expanding. I love learning. I'm going through a program at the moment, learning search engine optimization. I just love that feeling of like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And that has intrinsic worth. And it almost doesn't matter if it pans out to be anything. That for me is the drive itself. So I would say that everything I do has intrinsic value to me rather than extrinsic value. I don't know what this is, but I'm also driven by excellence is the wrong word. It's so overused, but it kind of captures something. I get super frustrated by what I see as mediocrity. And I'm very mediocre myself, which is probably why I get incensed by it, because it's a reflection of me. Like, it's so funny. I was talking to Ruth, as you know, our managing director, and I get sometimes a bit annoyed with people's mistakes. And she said, Nick, how do you feel about your own self making mistakes? And I said, I know, Ruth, but that's why I need people to replace me. Like, that's my, I make mistakes, but I don't want the company to make mistakes. You know, I don't want to employ a bunch of Nick Boltons. We're in trouble if we do. So I think there's a part of me that wants Animas to kind of really to exude and to deliver excellence, and that's through the systems we build. And that drives me, and I don't know why it drives me. I really don't know why it drives me. There's no obvious reason. It's not because, well, if we're excellent, we'll make more money. It's not that at all. Again, it's intrinsically valuable to me to have excellence as our core. You know, so we just rebuilt our website. It feels so nice to see what I think is a beautiful website rather than one before. It makes no difference to the business, but intrinsically to me it does. So I think my drivers are growth and learning. And, you know, I often describe myself as a business artist. I used to say, like, I'm not an entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs are always looking for the next opportunity. And I'm not a business person in the sense of I'm a businessman, because that's more about simply the bottom line and how do you make a business that's very efficient and effective. I always see myself as a business artist. I'm trying to create a thing of beauty. And that's not just about how it works inside, it's about how it shows itself in the world. And so I guess that's, you know, I went to art school. And I did a foundations in fine art, and I had a place to do a degree in fine art, but I ended up doing philosophy. And I often think that business for me is like a sublimated version of art. You know, like, I'm just trying to create this beautiful masterpiece.
I mean, everything is art in a way, isn't it? It can be artistic. That's interesting to hear about your degree in art that you didn't take up. I didn't know that. So it really sounds like your internal drivers are the thing itself, learning for the sake of learning, wanting something to be beautiful or excellent for the sake of that. And then the outcomes and output of that is the business that you have and is the skills that you have that you've learned, which ultimately feed into your business. Because you name checked marketing, philosophy, coaching, supervision. You name checked all the things that I kind of think that you're interested in, which also feeds into your business, right? Is there anything that sits outside of those things? Because SEO obviously fits into your business as well. Do you learn about stuff for the sake of it that doesn't fit into that kind of quadrant of topics?
Not a lot. Not when it comes to learning. I have interests outside that aren't about learning. Long distance cycling, where I can, trekking, those sorts of things, but they're not learning. their experiences. So no, I think I learn what I need to learn that are connected. I would say the business is a reflection of what I love learning about rather than vice versa in some ways.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of looking at as well. It's a natural output of your endeavors and passions.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, as we're talking about all this, I'm thinking, my goodness, there's a lot of Platonic philosophy in how I'm talking. You know, a lot of Socratic, not so much Socratic questioning, but the Socrates dialogues, a lot of them about the idea of excellence as an intrinsically valuable thing. And this idea of the Platonic forms that exist outside of the human realm. And it almost feels like at some level, I'm striving to make Animas a Platonic form of a coach training school. Because it's not just about, well, what's practically a good school? It's like, how do I try to transcend to a Platonic form of a coaching school? It's kind of a weird thing, but it just occurred to me as we're talking.
What does Platonic form even mean? I don't actually know. You have to tell me.
So one of Plato's sort of theories was that everything has a form that exists beyond the human realm. So justice, there's a form of justice that everything else is a corrupt version of. So any human justice attempts to connect to this thing called the form of justice. In other words, in order to have any kind of word called justice, you need to have something that means that's justice. But most human forms of that are kind of a corrupt, vague version of it. But there's a Platonic form of love, a Platonic form of justice, a Platonic form of courage, a Platonic form of etc., etc. But everything has a Platonic form, and you can never get there because it's an abstract concept. But you can try to achieve it, and it's weird as I talk about this. I'm like, I'm almost trying to achieve a Platonic form of a coaching school or a business, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I feel like I understand a bit more of your internal drivers, or as you think about it on the fly. All right, well, let's look at, I mean, there's a lot to get through. Let's look at you building the business now, Animas. So you created the Smart School 2008, 2010. This is you doing the face-to-face marketing expose. Do you want to just sort of give us a bit more of a potted history?
Yeah, very briefly. The Smart School 2008, I had my very first intake of coaches in 2008, 12 people. And it was great, you know, so fun because I was doing everything myself, everything. From the bookkeeping to the training to the course creation to the marketing to the selling, everything. And I remember one time receiving a check in the post. I can still remember who sent it to me as well. And it was for £2,500. And it said, "Dear Nick, you never charged me for the course." That's how ramshackle things were when I first started. And it was great fun, you know, apart from doing the shows, which I really, really didn't like. It was still great fun. But very quickly I realized, well, this was just me doing everything. And very quickly I realized, well, this isn't sustainable. So I started to identify who in my training group could be a potential trainer, and started to slowly build a system where people would kind of freelance me as trainers. And I'm talking like that was probably itself about 3 years worth of journey, like encapsulated just in that little sentence. I went probably 3 years of doing it myself before I finally took somebody on in a freelance capacity to support me. And then in 2013, I mean, I knew straight away that the Smart School was a horrible name. Like after about a year, I was like, why did I call it the Smart School? What a terrible name. But it was like, I was still in that kind of traction gaining phase. So I wasn't going to change the name. And then in 2013, I'd had enough. And I was like, right, I've got to represent my coaching school the way I want it to be. And I thought to myself, we're not interested in SMART goals anymore. Not that they're not interesting and useful, but they're only part of the equation. So we sat back, myself and my community, which was very small at the time, and we're like, what do coaches really stand for? And that's when we came up with this realization that coaches stand for helping people face the truth and deal with it, hence Animas. So the whole journey of building the Smart School was one of replication, really. Shows, training, shows, training, shows, training. It was very much a slog, you know, a fun slog, but very much a slog.
And then here we are now in 2022, probably one of the most reputable coaching companies in the UK for sure, maybe Europe as well.
Maybe the world.
Maybe the world, yeah, perhaps. I noticed in the amount of recommendations and word of mouth referrals that are coming to us. So the word is out, so to speak, and that's been out for a long time. But I guess what I'm interested in is, what was it like to build Animas? What was your personal experience of building Animas? Because these are a couple of things I know. I'll just put them out there and let's see where it goes. I know the philosophy's kind of meandered a little bit. I know you've been in and out of retirement. I know there's been a bit of a pivot, and the business has shrunk. And maybe we're around 2015 now, as we're kind of chronologically tracking it, as you sort of bring the trainers in and make it a bit more sustainable. Those are a few things I know. Can you speak to some of that personal experience of building Animas?
Yeah, it's kind of related to the whole journey you've just said, because the personal experience was really, really great. I loved it. Hard work. I mean, even in 2016, I was still living in a one-bed flat in Folkestone, which today, I sold it recently, but today it rents out at £340 a month. So you can imagine what kind of quality of flat it was to be renting at £340 a month. And that was in 2016. At that point, I had a team of 5-6 people, and I was paying myself less than any of them, way less. I was still in debt. I still had debt from my second divorce, believe it or not. And that year was the year I finally paid my debt off in full. Like, it was such an amazing thing to go, like, finally I'm free of my debt from all those years ago. But I was living in this little one-bed flat. I had a wicker chair, super hard wicker chair, and a table overlooking the railway station in Folkestone. And I sat there all day from 9 a.m. listening to Plan B, which is why Catherine Watkins said to me one day, "No wonder why you can keep your energy up if you listen to that sort of music." So listen to Plan B from 9 a.m. until 2 a.m. in the morning, solid working. And I loved it. I really, really loved growing my school. What happened was, though, that the more you grow a business and the more of a team you grow, the less connected you are to the front end of that business, and the more you lose visceral experience of it. And that's when things go wrong. That's why all these horrendous big companies treat you so badly, because the person that set it up all those many, many centuries ago or decades ago is no longer there. You know, M&S or Tesco, you know, those were real people once, and now they're just these massive conglomerates. And it's no different in a way, even on a small scale, is that as a founder, you lose touch with the reality of the business, because you've got this team doing all the stuff. The team are doing the customer service, the team are doing the training, the team are doing this, and the team. So all of a sudden, you're just this kind of weird, dislocated human being in this system where you're not experiencing. And that's when I started to fall out of love with the business, because it literally did become just a business. And I felt like the way I described it at the time was I was like a lobster on the bottom of the ocean, snaffling up all the detritus that fell from above. So all my team were like the big fish swimming around, eating nice juicy fish and having a nice time, doing significant work. And I was at the bottom of the ocean just dealing with all the problems, all the grot that fell to me. And it was depressing. Well, not depressing. I wouldn't ever use that word depressing in the sense of real depressing, but it was like really, really not a nice experience. Just all you're doing is firefighting other people's problems. And you don't know quite, you're not a good enough entrepreneur, or you don't have enough money or whatever to put in place systems that mean you don't have to deal with that grotty stuff. And in 2017 and 18, I just got to a breaking point where I just thought, I don't like this anymore. I don't like running this school this way. It's a business, it works, but it's not serving me as a human being. I'm not getting any joy from it. And so I decided enough's enough, I'm retiring. And so at the end of 2018, I sat down with my team and said, look, I've got to get out. I just can't do this anymore. And I said, you know, are you up for running it? And they were like, yeah, definitely, we want to do this. And so I retired, and I bought a boat with my wife, my second boat living on. My wife and I got this boat from Poland, had it shipped over, a really, really beautiful boat. And we cruised the UK canals for 2.5 years. And it was amazing for me to take that break. I wasn't fully out of it. I'd often have, I'd have lots of conversations with my CEO at the time, but I was significantly out of it. And it really gave me a time to go, like, to collect my thoughts and my values, and to reconnect with what I wanted Animas to be, which wasn't what it was becoming. And then, of course, coronavirus struck in 2020, and that shook everything up, because we went from being in-person training to virtual pretty much overnight. And in a way, that was an amazing opportunity for us as a business, but it also it meant that we grew way too fast, and we didn't have in place the structures for that kind of growth. And so that also really confronted me, living on my boat from afar and looking at it going, like, am I okay with that? Is that what I want Animas to become like? It was a funny experience, because financially it was amazing, no question. As a business, it was like, wow, that's good. but I'm also going, all right, but is that really what I wanted to build? And that's what led to me coming back in 2021 and saying, all right, what do I really want this company to be like? And if I'm going to come back, I want to run it without compromise. I want to make sure that this business is the way it's going to make me feel happy and proud, rather than just make me a successful business person.
Thank you. And when I think of you as the lobster on the floor, the kind of meaning I give that is that, in a way, you were working for the business rather than the business working for you. And that's that kind of evolution of that thought process of like, hold on, I don't like this anymore. I want to make something that I do like. And that's been the modern evolution of Animas, shall we say then?
Totally. It's funny, it's like, this is not an unusual experience. The more I read about it afterwards, the more I realized that's an incredibly archetypal entrepreneurial journey. Is you get to a point where you start off doing everything yourself, you love it, it's brilliant because you experience it all, and then slowly you get distance from everything because you build a team, and then one day you suddenly go, this isn't my business anymore. And it's incredibly normal. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs go through that phase of saying, well, okay, what do I want to do with that? Some people stick with it and they just become an unhappy entrepreneur, unhappy business owner. And some people do what I did and try to break away and try to reconfigure it to serve them. I'm glad I did.
A question I've got for you. In that evolution, I know that the business has sort of shrunk. There's been a bit of contraction both ways, hasn't there, over the years? But at the minute, I know that there's a contraction and a purposeful shrinking of the business to create something beautiful. What's it like to be the boss that has to make people redundant, or that tells people that actually your time up is here, your time in the company is up, this is why? What's it like for you as a human being to have to go through that process?
Well, obviously it's never nice, that's for sure. And I suspect I've always been pretty generous with how I've done it when it comes to the sort of the financial side. But I don't think that matters in a way. There's a human impact on that person that just can't be negated through any kind of financial settlement, and it almost always leaves bad feelings. And it's a sad reality that the feelings that people are left with are the ones they end up with, not the ones that they had most of the time. And so you kind of have to get used to the fact that you're going to be disliked, or at least thought of not in the best way, by that person for quite a long time, I suspect. And at the same time, you have these moments where that's resolved. And I had somebody I had to let go of a few years ago who rang me a couple of years later and said, Nick, I've got my own business now. She said, I can finally see what you're experiencing. And I can see why that you had to let me go. And I just want to say, I'm sorry that I was such a pain at the time. And I was like, don't worry. It felt so nice to reconnect to a human at that level of like, we're just people doing the best we can. I've got a business to run. I've got customers to look after. I've got a team to look after. You can't have a business that's ineffective and set up in the wrong way. So you have to make tough decisions. And it is what it is. You have to figure out how to do that in the most humane way possible, which I try to do. But I also recognize it almost doesn't matter what you do. It's a bit like splitting up, like there's no divorce, there's no relationship split up where both parties feel completely, very rarely, I can think of one in my life where we both feel like, yeah, shake hands, So it was almost like that, shake hands and we stayed friends. Very rare. And that's no different from this. People are left with bad feelings that they were rejected or weren't needed, or they gave their best years to you and then they were suddenly cast out, and all this sort of stuff. And of course, to be honest, for me, all that's a story we tell ourselves. I remember when my boss, before I started my conference company, he was doing something and I went, Lewis, and I was broke at the time, but I was like, no, this is my life. I said, Lewis, it's beneath me to work for you. And I literally left his building and he ran down the street after me, said, Nick, come back, we can sort this out. And so my attitude to employment has always been, you've just got to serve you as an employee. And this idea that somehow we hang on to things doesn't make sense to me, but that's just me, that's my worldview. I recognize I'm pretty unusual in that way.
I'm not sure. I mean, it makes sense to me. Not that I'm not sure that other people might not have that thought process. But I said to you before the call, it's interesting because in a way I sell you my time, right, to be employed by you, but there's a reciprocal thing that's going on between us. You get something out of it, I get something out of it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really end mutually ever, does it? It's always, I will hand my notice in and it might cause you a bit of a headache, or you might hand my notice in and it caused me a bit of a headache, because usually these things come out of the blue. Someone's made a decision, and I guess that is just a really hard human experience to have whatever side of the fence.
It's hard if you make it hard. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to me. I mean, I'll give you an example. You know what happened with Crystal. Crystal was our head of learning, and she was, to my mind, she was intrinsic to my plans for how we moved forward throughout 2022, 2023. But I was in a meeting up in Coventry, and I had this sudden thing appears in my calendar, meeting with Nick from Crystal, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? And it said something like, want to have an important conversation. I said, that doesn't sound good. You know, like when everyone said something like an important conversation, So I'm driving in my car and I pull over on the service station. I'm like, hey, Crystal. It's like, Nick. She sounded a bit nervous. And she said, Nick, I've got this opportunity to go and work for the mayor's office doing equality work for the police force. And it's a 3-month, 3-month secondment. I know that it's going to affect Animas, but I really want to do this. Obviously, I need to give you a month's notice, because you need to get things in order, and then I'll take my 3 months. I said, Crystal, stop. What is it you actually want to happen? What do you really want to happen? And she said, well, I'd love to start it next week if I could. Let's do that. I said, you don't need to give me a month's notice. Why would you do that? That's just what it says on paper. Let's do what's right for you. And she was like, oh, that's amazing, Nick. And I said, here's the thing. You might go. And she said, you're not going to let me go, or something like that. And I said, look, if my wife wants to travel the world for 3 months, I'm not going to divorce her. But when she's traveling the world, she meets Pablo in Brazil, probably it'll end in divorce. And I said, it's no different from you. Like, you might go off and work for the mayor's office, and in that journey, you'll suddenly realize, I want to keep doing this work. And if you do, we have that conversation and we deal with it. That's exactly what happened. No bad feelings. That's her life. That's her choice. That's what she's got every right to construct a life that gives her more meaning than she's going to get at Animas or wherever else she might find it. 100%. Not a tiniest shred of bad feeling on my part. Nothing. Because that's the whole point of what Animas stands for. Face what's true and deal with it. My job is to then face my truth, which is, do I need to replace her? Don't I need to replace her? What do we do with that? No problem at all. It's all choice. It's very, 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 very little in this world would cause me to feel bad about what I've got to deal with, because that's what I sign up for when you start a business or get married or whatever else it is you do.
Thank you for answering that question with such detail and honesty. Anything else that you would add to your business building journey and your personal experience of it from, let's say the last 5 years of Animas? We kind of covered the pandemic, you going in and out of retirement, we kind of covered. Anything else you would add?
Depends on for what purpose. Like if somebody is listening to this as a business building kind of thing, then the one thing I'd add is somebody asked me the other day, what's your greatest achievement? And I said, still being in business 14 years later. Like, she was like, is it moving to a transformative approach to coaching? I'm like, no, it's still being in business. Running a business is tough. And I would say that if I can reflect on the whole thing, it's just this absolute need for sheer persistence and tenacity that I think that drives success. You can definitely learn tactics, you can learn strategies and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately none of that works if you don't have this underlying complete conviction in your ability to make it work. And it's so interesting, the number of people I meet who I know are going to succeed because you can feel inside them this absolute conviction in their own ability. And then other people are more like, what are my tactics or strategies? And unless they get that solid core, it's going to be tough, because business is tough. It really is. I used to think, number one, I'm an atheist, and I've been an atheist all my life. And number two, I'm an entrepreneur. And both of those come as a gift and a curse, because every single day you have to wake up and make your own meaning about life as an atheist. And number two, you have to wake up every single day and make your own income as an entrepreneur. I don't rely on anyone to provide me an income, and I don't rely on anyone to provide me with a meaning. It's got to come from me. And so that's kind of a tough ask sometimes,
You're constantly generating, having to generate.
Yeah,
and I think maybe that question got asked for me then, because maybe you'll say something different when I ask this question. When you look back at your business building journey, if you were going to give yourself some advice, when you're in that expo, doing that face-to-face marketing, you're about to embark on this 10-15 year entrepreneurial, I guess, journey, what would you say to yourself then?
I'm going to give you two answers. The first one is probably the most truthful, but it's also the least interesting, which is I probably wouldn't give myself any advice, because you've got to live it. You know what I mean? You've really got to live it. You've got to experience it. But let's say I could give myself some advice. This is such a boring answer as well. But I would say get the fundamentals of how the business works right. Because where I think most businesses go wrong is they don't get the foundations right. They get the pricing wrong. They get the structure of how they deliver something wrong, and the business doesn't work. So for probably the first 5 years, I was bumping along the bottom of like the business ocean, trying to figure out, how do I make it do that? It was like boom, 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 boom. You never had enough cash flow, never had enough profit, never had enough time. But I could have solved that so quickly had I got the pricing right. But I was too scared of getting the pricing right. Had I got the right team, but I was too scared of hiring too quickly, and all these sorts of things. So looking back, I'd say get the internal mechanics of the business right. It's such a boring answer, but it's the truth. As a business owner, the internal mechanics of how a business works are way more important than what you actually do, in my opinion. I know a lot of business owners, and I get to see their balance sheets, and I get to see their profit and loss, and I can see when a business doesn't have its internal structure right versus when it does. And it's day and night in terms of what they have to experience. The number of business owners I meet who get stressed during payroll time. Oh my God, it's payroll. During VAT, it doesn't even register on my radar that it's payroll time or that it's VAT time, and that's how it should be as a business owner. But so many business owners are struggling with cash flow. It's terrible, really terrible. And I struggled with cash flow for the first 5 years. So it's such a terrible answer for a coach watching this, but that's the truth of being a business owner.
Well, I didn't think it was a terrible answer. It was interesting because you gave the first answer, which was kind of philosophical in the sense that you've got to live it. You learn through your mistakes and through the experience, right? But then also you kind of, I guess, pointed out the nuts and bolts of what's important in business. And that same thing, I think, is transferable to coaches when we think about the way we price ourselves and value our time. And a lot of coaches that I work with, and perhaps myself included, is still valuing it just too low in order to create forward momentum, and feeling that always being busy because you're just not really got the pricing and the structure correct to give you the time to develop as a coach, as a human being. Right. We need space, right, as we're developing business. And what I hear is that gives you space when you get that structure right and the pricing right.
It definitely does. But this is what I mean by my first answer, which is I wouldn't give myself any advice, because you've got to live it. Like I could say to you now, Brins, you're charging too little, or you're doing this, or you're doing that. It doesn't matter, because you've got to emotionally experience that before you finally go, enough's enough. Yeah. And that's my point. I could have said something to myself, but it would have been like, doesn't matter. You know what was I can remember the critical moment where I decided to get the structure right. I read a book called Found Money by Steve Wilkinghoff, which is looking at where does the money go in a business. And he started off describing it. He says, most business owners are walking a dog, and the dog is their business, and it's a big dog. And they think they're walking the dog, but when the dog smells something, that dog starts walking them. And he says that's how most business owners experience it. He then describes what it's like and the feelings, and he starts going like, you're making money, but you look in your bank account and you say to yourself, where's all the money? And he described it, and I went, that's me. But I couldn't have had the experience of saying that's me had I not gone through it. And so once I read that book, I was like, oh my goodness, that's me. I was able to go, what? So there's a solution to this? Do you know what I mean? So that's why I think you've got to live it before you can really solve it.
Yeah, it completely resonates. I'm just aware of time, and I'm thinking about landing this conversation. You mentioned a book that you read, and it kind of reminded me of something I want to speak to you about. A lot of people name check you as a mentor or a bit of an inspiration, or someone that they've worked with that has really helped propel their career in the coaching industry. Do you have any people that you look back at and think that was really important that I had them, or this book was really seminal in my development?
Yeah, lots. Not so much lots of people, some people, lots of books, 100%. I mean, I'm an avid reader. And so there's a lot of books I go like, wow, that really, even now I'm reading an amazing book called Implausible Professions, which is really making me rethink a lot of my assumptions of a profession I've been in for, however many years, like nearly 20 years. So there's a lot of books I read all the time. But in terms of people, yeah, there are several critical ones. I did a master's in psychological coaching at Metanoia, and there was a guy there who ran the program called Simon Kavikia, who now works at Ashridge. And Simon was really profoundly impactful for me. When I was a trainer originally, I wasn't a trainer before my own school. I never learned how to train, so I just suddenly made it up. And looking back, it's like embarrassing how bad I was. I mean, people seem to like me, but I look back and I think, oh my God, I was such an authority figure. I'd stand at the front and I'd train and I'd teach and I'd be like, "Rrr." And then I met Simon, and Simon's got this beautiful way of creating space where the learning emerges from the group. And I was like, wow, I love that. And that really, really, really impacted Animas. Like, there's no question Animas is a different school now because of my doing my master's at Metanoia. Very, very different approach to training. And I always wished I could create the same thing, because we used to have sofas, like there were sofas all around the room. We'd all be lounging. And also, by the way, I didn't have a nice time there. I had 2 very uncomfortable years there, because I'm not a brilliant person in groups. I can create a lot of discomfort because I name things. And so it was I remember saying at one point, I realized I don't belong here. I should have gone to the Existential Academy. But nonetheless, super profound. And then I've had a mentor. He's kind of a mentor, a guy called Dan Bradbury, who I've known for years now, who runs business mentoring group. But he's not really a mentor, more of a facilitator of business thinking. And he's been profoundly impactful for me in terms of how I think about business. And then in terms of books, one of the books that made the biggest difference to me was one called Coaching Relationships, edited by Eric DeHaan. And that was to do with how you work with the relationship in the coaching to create the change. Instead of only thinking about what's out there, what's the there and then conversation, or what's over there in the future, you're also working on what's happening here. And that was a really great book. It wasn't just Eric DeHaan, it was several authors, but that was a beautiful book. So there have been lots of books that have had an impact, but I would say Simon Kavikia, Dan Bradbury, and that book, Coaching Relationships, were probably the 3 that really come figural to mind for me.
Thank you. Fascinating, and really interesting to hear you talk about that book that's making you rethink the whole profession, because I saw the post you made, and it's something that I've been thinking about as well. There's a guy called Daniel Mackler who does a critique on psychotherapy. It's a really good YouTube video, and I kind of wanted to have a conversation with you, but that's a different conversation that perhaps we could record, who knows. All right, let's have a look at current state of the profession and future of the profession. What comes up for you when you think about that?
I actually think we're in a really good state, a lot better state than we were when I started as a coach. I mean, when I started, I often talk about the 3 ages of coaching: the cowboy era, the codified era, and the integrative era. The cowboy era was just anyone was doing anything. And then the codified era was like the ICF came on, the EMCC, and it was all like, right, we're going to absolutely nail this to the floor, and we're going to make sure there's nobody contravenes any rules. And then over time, we've become more like, okay, let's get a bit more mature about this. And we're in this really beautiful era of maturity now, I'd say, as a profession. And at the same time as the intellectual maturity, you've also got the maturity of the infrastructures. So all these big organizations like BetterUp and Coach Hub and all these umbrella organizations growing up, which did not exist even 5-10 years ago. You to succeed as a coach, you either had to be an internal coach or you had to be a very good entrepreneur. Now you've got these institutions that are coming up where you can, if you've got the right credibility and so on, experience, you can slot into them. I think that's amazing, and I can only see that growing. And then you've also got the growth of internal coaching, where more and more organizations are training internal capacity to deliver coaching. So I think we are in a very good state as a profession. There are still things that are challenging us, I would say. The overemphasis on what I would call pure coaching. I think that needs to shift. There needs to be more maturity around relationship in coaching, not just simply this thing called coaching, which is rigidified. But apart from that, I think as a profession, we're in a great state. And, I would love Animas to contribute to that. I think you've got the growth of all these gray areas coming in, like, coaching and mental health and coaching and trauma. And I think we need to engage in that in a more meaningful way, because at some level, they become very attractive to coaches. But that can be dangerous if you don't have the infrastructure in place to look at what they mean. And when we say coaching and trauma, be careful what we wish for, but at the same time, it is there. So how do we deal with that? So I think there's another sort of stage we need to go to about how do we begin to bring in these other disciplines or different issues, but in a way that's appropriate to the skill level of the coaches. So all that is, we're kind of dealing with all that sort of stuff at the moment, I feel. Oh, you're on mute, Sprins.
So thanks. I want to keep going here, but I know we've got to land this shortly, but I'm interested in the tension here. Or I call it tension. What I perceive is you and your coaching philosophy, you own a business that is very much tied to the ICF core competencies, pure coaching, as you say. What's it like to be in that place of having your philosophy as a coach and a human being, but also knowing that a lot of people coming into the industry want an accreditation, they want a credential, they want a black and white, this is coaching, this is not coaching. And as most coaches develop, I say most, don't know if that's true, some coaches, as they develop, they might like to work in the grey, which you kind of spoke to. What's it like for you to hold those two pieces, what your philosophy is and then the business philosophy?
I've become much more reconciled with it. I remember reading Irvin Yalom's book, The Gift of Therapy, and he talks about how the more experienced you become as a therapist, the harder it is to train new therapists, or as he calls them, neophytes. And I think there's a lot of truth there, which is why I haven't done any training for years, because you get to a point where it's really hard to remember what it's like not to know that asking a question is the best way to evoke change. It's really hard to remember that. And so I haven't trained for years. I did struggle with the over-regulation for a while, but now I realize that the truth is that it's not a bad thing. There's two issues. Number one, it is what it is. So going back to my Animas thing, you have to face the truth. And the truth is that coaching is becoming accredited and regulated to some degree. So for us to go like, we're not going to bother doing that would be a disservice to those who want to become coaches through us. So number one, you have to recognize that's the world we're in. Accreditation matters. We have to deliver on it. So it's a very strategic thing. Number two, I also recognize that the coaches who keep going will find their own maturity. You know, what we're trying to do is break them away from the bad habits that most people come into when they're first going to train as a coach, and they give advice and they want to do therapy as well. And it's like, no, let's stick to coaching. But as they mature, they will start to break those boundaries by themselves. They don't need me to teach them how to do that. That will come with time. So I kind of feel like I'm okay that as a school, we give them these guardrails, and that at some point as a coach, they'll step over those guardrails when it's the right time.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, as we look to the future then, for you as an individual and also Animas, what comes up for you? What's in the horizon?
Joy of life. So I've been planning out my 2023, and you know, when I'm flying out to Rome with my wife, we think May, but it could be September, and I'm taking my bike with me, and she's going to then fly back after a few days, and I'm going to cycle back. And because last time I tried to cycle to Rome this year, and I got to Lyon, and I realized that getting home was a nightmare. So I thought, right, this time I'm going to fly to Rome and then cycle back. I've got no excuse then. So 2023 is going to be a year of adventures. So I want to make sure that I'm doing a lot of cycling. I want to do Land's End to John O'Groats again in 2024. And so I want Animas I want to create Animas in a way that allows me to experience life to the full, physically. I really love adventure. I love going to the Himalayas and trekking. And I read a book recently called Die with Zero, which was about the idea that you shouldn't die with money in the bank. You know, money is a means to an end, not something you hoard. And something in that book woke me up to the fact that I'm 53 years old and I'm super fit, but that won't last forever. And I suddenly started realizing, my goodness, if I don't fully take advantage of the next 13 to 20 years, it's going to come to an end. And so I've realized that I want to really spend my time making sure I go trekking, making sure I go cycling, making sure I go, you know, on walking trips with my wife and all that sort of stuff. And then allowing Animas to be what it can be at its best, and allowing me to do thought leadership around that without interfering too much in that central piece. And I just think I see a lot of joy ahead, to be honest, for myself, selfishly, but also I hope for those who work with and encounter Animas, because it's going to be a more beautiful thing.
And Animas?
Yeah, as I say, I want to keep it a more beautiful thing. So I really think that we're going to keep it roughly the same size. I see a lot more thought leadership coming, events. We've taken on a head of events, or events coordinator rather, and we're going to be doing a number of conferences next year, one on internal coaching, one on coaching and mental health. We'll do our second annual Transformative Coaching Summit. So I see a lot more events coming up. We're going to do monthly lectures from the faculty. So I want to do I want to kind of keep, I see like Animas as this kind of core piece that works, but then I want to wrap that core piece with a really engaging community of events and so on that help people expand their thinking. But apart from that, keep it broadly the same, but more beautiful.
Great. And what about the group coaching program? Is that on the horizon? Not on the horizon? I heard there might be.
That's definitely on the horizon for late 2023. I will probably be delivering it myself. I'm not sure whether it's going to be video-based learning or live learning or anything. I'm not sure yet, but we definitely want to do that because group coaching is amazing, but it's a very different skill set, unquestionably.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you so much. I could have kept going and going, but I'm going to have to wrap it up here. Otherwise, it's going to be a 2-hour-long interview.
A Joe Rogan interview.
Exactly. Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate your honesty, all your answers. I've had a really great time. So all the best.
Thanks, Brent.